This channel is part of the History Hit network.
In post-World War I Germany, the law had been a most respected entity, with the country regaining some stability, in part due to capable lawyers and judges, many of them Jewish. In 1933, no law could inhibit Germany's political and military rise to power. In a step-by-step process, the National Socialist government dismantled constitutional law, usurped justice, and created a lethal totalitarian system that soon engulfed Germany and all of Europe. Redefining the nation as a pure political and biological organism, the Nazi government imposed legislation that reinforced its ideological program in all aspects of German life, with a focus on race, business, religion, and medicine.
Adolf Hitler is dead. He is dead, and how he died, the world little cares. For Hitler's death, millions have prayed, and millions are now thankful for justice. 1920, Hitler began. He was considered just a joke then, a raving crackpot.
At the dawn of the National Socialist Party in Munich in 1923, a little-known Austrian political upstart by the name of Adolf Hitler naively attempted to overthrow the Weimar government of President Friedrich Ebert. Historically, the Bavarian beer hall served as a locale of camaraderie and occasional ideological meetings.
The beer hall which took place in November of 1923, the Weimar Republic, which started out in 1920, was in crisis. Certainly, the Weimar Republic had all kinds of obstacles to try to overcome. Its leaders were seen as responsible for Germany's surrender in World War I, which no one in Germany expected. They were also seen as responsible for the Versailles Treaty, which all Germans felt was incredibly unfair, even though both the surrender and the need to sign that treaty were really dictated by the generals, who felt that Germany could not sustain further military action.
On November 8th, with 600 stormtroopers led by Ernst Röhm, Hitler descended upon the Bürgerbräu-Keller and shouted out, "The national revolution has broken out. The hall is surrounded." After several speeches by Putsch leaders, Hitler left, wrongly believing the revolution had begun.
If you love history, then you'll love History Hit. Our extensive library of documentary features everything from the ancient origins of our earliest ancestors to the daring mission to sink the Bismarck. History Hit has hundreds of exclusive documentaries with unrivaled access to the world's best historians. We're committed to bringing history fans award-winning documentaries and podcasts that you cannot find anywhere else. Sign up now for a free trial, and Timeline fans get 50% off their first 3 months. Just be sure to use the code TIMELINE at checkout.
Having created a political movement out of what was a very small German Workers' Party, Adolf Hitler, inspired by what Benito Mussolini had done in Italy, where he had been able to organize a march on Rome, which put him in a position of power, felt that he could do the same thing. Now, in his case, he had to start from Munich in Bavaria, which is where the Nazi Party had begun and built itself up. And his plan was twofold. He was going to coerce the leaders of Munich and Bavaria into moving out of his way, and he was then going to march on Berlin.
At 11 a.m. on November 9th, Hitler and his followers attempted to take over Munich public buildings. But the armed police and army, alerted to the Nazi Party's actions, fired upon the marchers. This left 16 Nazi martyrs whose blood soaked the swastika banner of the newly formed Nazi Party.
In 1923, there was a great deal of economic turmoil in Germany, and Hitler decided to seize the occasion to try to dismantle the democratic process in Germany and essentially establish a dictatorship. The interesting part of the beer hall putsch is that the putsch itself was so poorly disorganized that he never left the city limits, so that he ended up being tried in a local court. Had he made it outside of the city limits or even on his way to Berlin, he could have been tried for treason in the national court and in fact have faced a death sentence.
Nuremberg Prison, where Hitler wrote his credo of hate during his imprisonment in 1924, following the unsuccessful beer hall putsch. This was a hallowed shrine to official Nazis, but to American GIs, it's just a jail that Hitler never should have left.
Although Hitler was sentenced to 5 years in Landsberg prison, he was imprisoned less than 9 months, during which time he continued to build his party network and dictate his blueprint for the Nazi Party program. Mein Kampf provided the seminal ideas for the party's attack on Jews and communists, based upon political and racial laws.
Once Hitler realized that he wasn't going to be able to take power by force, he decided he had to use the political processes to attain power. And he manages to build the most successful political party in Weimar Germany and become the most successful leader. And you know, it's amazing because up until the elections of 1930, it doesn't look like he's getting anywhere. He had this idea, build it and they will come, that if he created the infrastructure for a wide-scale political movement, the opportunity would come along. He recruits, he develops propaganda techniques, he learns to use technology, he recruits a successful group of lieutenants. And when the Great Depression strikes, and once again the Weimar Republic is vulnerable, it is Hitler and the Nazis that are in this position to capitalize on that and move to power. But he had always said that he was going to use the Constitution to destroy the Constitution. And he was going to use the rules of the Republic to destroy the Republic. Certainly the Reichstag fire, which occurs in February of 1933, helps him.
Here you see the Reichstag, the German House of Parliament in Berlin, which has been seriously destroyed by fire.
The Reichstagsfire was essentially the 9/11 of Germany. Adolf Hitler had been chancellor of the country for less than a month. There were crucial national elections a week away. And suddenly, this very symbol of German democratic process goes up in flames in an arson attack. The Nazis exploited this event to great effect. The Hitler government immediately blames the communists for this, and the next day Hitler approaches the president and he says, we need to suspend civil liberties. Hindenburg was hesitant, but ultimately signed, and that essentially was the first major step in the dismantling of the democratic system. In the atmosphere that existed at that point, a lot of Germans were willing to sacrifice certain liberties for the sake of national security. And once again, I think, given what the United States went through after 9/11, I think one can understand that. And I'm not saying that the dynamics or even the situation was the same, but it can, if one wants to try to imagine what it was like in Germany at that point. Germany changed with the seizure of power in January '33, dramatically, but not immediately. It was actually an extended process that the Germans called the Gleichschaltungsprozess.
By labeling the Reichstag fire as a terrorist attack by the communists, Hitler convinced President Paul von Hindenburg to suspend all civil liberties.
Hindenburg did not like Hitler. He could not even stand to be in the same room with the man, but the political constellations of things were such that he appointed Hitler as chancellor. Hitler then, along with the other Nazis, set about systematically dismantling the various pieces of democratic process. Some of it through legal means, some of it just subverting the system and ignoring certain laws.
The first major step in overthrowing the justice system occurred with the suspension of all civil liberties and the installation of protective custody, or Schutzhaft.
What happens in the enabling law is by this time, the Communist Party, as a result of the Reichstag fire, had been declared illegal. And that eliminates a powerful bloc of anti-Nazis from the Reichstag. At this point, Hitler goes to the Reichstag and asks for a 4-year dictatorial regime, which would suspend most civil liberties and virtually create a state of almost permanent emergency powers.
Der uns in den 14 Punkten Bildungs gemachten Zusicherungen begann für Deutschland.
At the Kroll Opera House in March of 1933, Hitler proposed the law for removing the distress of Volk and Reich. To keep the Volk secure, the communist ideological enemies were rounded up and imprisoned.
Hier wird ein Gesetz alles Handeln bestimmen. Das Volk lebt nicht für die Wirtschaft und die Wirtschaft existiert nicht für das Kapital, sondern das Kapital dient der Wirtschaft und die Wirtschaft dem Volk.
One of the pro-communist anti-Nazi lawyers caught in the web was Hans Littin, who had defended communists against the wrath of violent Nazis, even daring to question Hitler on the stand for 3 hours in a 1931 trial. Hitler never forgot what he viewed as humiliation at the hands of Littin, and eventually deemed the prominent attorney an enemy of the state. Sent to a concentration camp, this honorable half-Jewish attorney paid for his integrity. After 5 years of Nazi torture in a concentration camp, Littin committed suicide. In March 1933, in an effort to confine the enemies of the state, an old munitions plant on the outskirts of Munich became the first Nazi concentration camp. After targeting the communists, Hitler turned his attention toward his next enemy, the Jews. From that time on, virulent anti-Semitism dominated the philosophy of the fast-growing party throughout the 12-year Reich. Hitler's 25-point National Socialist Party stressed the importance of segregating Jews from Aryan society, and soon led to abrogating all of their legal, civil, and political rights. On April 7, 1933, Parliament established its first major law to curtail the rights of Jewish citizens, the law for the restoration of the professional civil service. According to the Aryan paragraph, Jews were legally excluded from civil service positions. On the same day, a law was imposed that prevented Jews from admission to the bar. This legal assault had devastating consequences for Jewish lawyers. For the most part, Aryan attorneys were pleased, and few voiced any negative reaction to such violations of justice.
The history of Jewish lawyers in Nazi Germany really follows an arc from the unification of Germany in the 1870s through the Nazi era. With the unification of Germany, Jewish lawyers for the first time were allowed to enter into the legal profession. And they flowed into the legal profession, and they became very prominent in the legal profession. When the Nazis came into power in the winter of 1933, they immediately tried to reverse the emancipation of Jews and the liberal legal order which had allowed Jews to become part of it and in which Jews had played such an important role. The Nazis round up its opponents. It arrested, within several days, 4,000 of its political opponents. Among them were Jewish lawyers. But at that point, the Nazis were arresting its political opponents, not Jews as Jews, not Jewish lawyers as Jewish lawyers. But within several weeks, it became clear that the Nazis were going to target Jewish lawyers as well. There were attacks on courthouses organized by SA thugs who would enter into the courthouses, who would throw out Jewish lawyers, would throw out Jewish judges. Violence served a purpose for the Nazis. They used it to its full extent. They used it quickly, and they scared people. But the Nazis also realized that violence had its limits and that they could also use law in order to promote their agenda.
Hitler claimed that Nuremberg was the most German of cities, with a tradition that aligned itself with the nationalism of the 1930s. Known from medieval times as a city that burned Jews at the stake, Nuremberg continued to fuel animosity during the Third Reich. The city hosted the party rallies and also served as the venue for the promulgation of the Nuremberg laws. Hitler used the 1935 National Socialist Party Congress in Nuremberg to launch these infamous race laws. For Hitler, blood purity ensured the vitality of the 1,000-year Aryan Reich as defined in the Nuremberg laws of September 15, 1935.
Der Erde die Menschen nähren und aus der Fruchtbarkeit seiner Familien die Nation Ort erhält.
Hitler used the 1935 National Socialist Party Congress in Nuremberg to launch these infamous race laws. In this way, the government revoked Reich citizenship for Jews and prohibited Jews from marrying or having sexual relations with individuals of German or related blood.
These Nuremberg laws, they were the ones that really prescribed citizenship for Jews. Citizenship was something that would be granted, like a license. Only citizens had rights of citizenship. The second law was about keeping the purity of race. And it begins by prohibiting any kind of marriage between an Aryan and a Jew. It spells it out. If there is already a marriage, it's invalid. There were prescriptions, no kind of sexual relations. That was going to take a little bit of policing. And there was a provision that no non-German, Jewish or other, female servant could be kept in the house of Aryans under 45. That was going to go into effect a little bit later. The bulk of the law went right into effect the next day.
Ist der Versuch der gesetzlichen Regelung eines Problems, das im Falle des abermaligen Scheiterns dann durch Gesetz zur endgültigen Lösung der nationalsozialistischen Partei übertragen werden müsste. Hinter allen drei Gesetzen steht die Partei und mit ihr und hinter ihr die deutsche Nation.
But with these laws, there was so much exclusion. Jews were really being excluded from public life. They had no rights.
It didn't matter whether you were a religious Jew or not to Hitler. If you had a quarter to an eighth of your background Jewish, you were Jewish. So it wasn't a religious thing. It was a racial, ethnic. And so if you had a Jew, even if you converted, you were still Jewish according to the racial laws, based on your background, based on your lineage. And so it was a eugenic and genetic and hereditary. And it was all caught up in social Darwinism, but it was a genetic, and that was a different kind of anti-Semitism.
Through legal machinations, the Jewish community was also forced out of the medical profession and denied civil rights.
Basically, starting out in 1933, it was made extraordinarily difficult, almost impossible, for Jews to practice either profession of law or the profession of medicine. They were essentially outlawed from those two professions. And they were a major portion of those professions at the time. So, some people argue that this was an economic move, that the doctors and lawyers were happy to get rid of the Jewish doctors and lawyers. And that was part of it, but that's one reason it was supported so much, that no one really came out against it. But it was really a move to get rid of the Jews. It was a disgrace that the other doctors and lawyers didn't stand up for the Jewish doctors and lawyers, but I think that can be two reasons for that. One was they actually were fine with the Nazi propaganda and racial hygiene and really believed the Jews were infecting the national body of Germany. But economics was not irrelevant. It made those professions much scarcer, therefore they could charge more money, therefore they were more revered, so they had self-interest in that as well.
In the Nazi blueprint for a healthy society, those with disabilities had no place. A Berlin memorial today commemorates some 200,000 deemed not worthy of life by Hitler's manipulation of the law.
So the Nazis proposed racial laws beginning in 1933. That law was called the Law for the Prevention of Hereditarily Diseased Offspring. Now, I think even the language, the wording of that law is important. You're not preventing diseases, you're preventing diseased offspring. And what that law recommended, based on the science of the day, was that people who were considered not to be contributing to the genetic health of the body of the Reich could be forcibly sterilized. And in fact, that law actually said 50,000 Germans a year ought to be sterilized, even if it was against their will, for the good of the Reich. Those racial laws were important because they codified what authors Hoke and Binding had suggested in 1920 in a book in which they coined this phrase, life unworthy of life.
It began was the sterilization programs of Germans, of the retarded and the mentally ill. And so the sterilization program, 1933, the sterilization law, which allowed compulsory sterilization for the feeble-minded, which was a catch-all for anybody you wanted to sterilize. But the sterilization program moved into the child euthanasia program. And the child euthanasia program moved into the adult euthanasia program. Doctors involved in all of this. There were genetic sterilization courts where 2 physicians and a lawyer sat on the sterilization court. One physician had to be an expert on eugenetics or hereditary, and so they decided almost universally to allow sterilization. But after that, moved on to the euthanasia program, which is a misnomer, by the way. It was a murder. It wasn't euthanasia. These were not terminally ill people. It was just murder.
The strategy of Hitler's political regime was to undermine, dismantle, and decimate all ties to traditional religion. The government attempted to have the Volk aspire to a single national Reich Church under Reichsbishop Ludwig Müller.
Lieber Herr Reichsbischof, im Namen unseres Führers Adolf Hitler und im Namen der ganzen deutschen Jugend
Bishop Clemens von Galen risked his life by giving an anti-euthanasia sermon in Münster on August 3, 1941. Due to his strong protest, the euthanasia policy was scaled back.
In 1937, the relationship between the church and state in Germany had reached a point where there was great tension, specifically on the freedom of Catholic organizations, the arrest of Catholic clergy, and the situation of Catholic schools and religious education being taught in schools, and the future question of Catholic youth groups and ministry to youth. And with that, the German bishops were so concerned that they petitioned the Holy Father, the Pope, to do something about that, to try to protest. The result, with input from the German bishops, was an encyclical, Mit brennender Sorge, with burning desire, with burning concern, stating that the German Catholic Church was under persecution and that the Reich government was in no way following what it promised to do in the Reich-Vatican Concordat agreement. That statement was actually read on Palm Sunday from the various pulpits throughout Germany. The Gestapo tried to confiscate any of the printed copies throughout. They allowed them to be printed, but then they confiscated them throughout the Reich. But the information and the protest was lodged, and it was heard very clear.
The Reich passed the law for the restoration of the professional civil service. And while this did not require the churches to employ only non-Jewish pastors, many in the churches, certainly not all, but many sought to implement that policy in the church. There were antagonistic policies on the part of the Reich towards the churches. So in 1937, the confessing church seminaries, which had been operating for a few years, were closed down. They were declared illegal, so they had to go underground to talk about the Bible, to train people for ministry and these sorts of things. Then in 1939, all of the confessional schools, both Protestant and Catholic, were closed throughout Germany. So there was a very antagonistic approach on the parts of the regime. So when we talk about the persecution of the Christian churches, and in particular the Protestant church, I think it's important to emphasize that the churches were rather aggressively pursued by the Nazis in the early years from 1933 to 1937. There were plenty of laws that were passed against them.
In the Third Reich, Jehovah's Witnesses faced a unique choice with regard to their faith.
And to see how they have grown, we have seen how he has guided them as they made the truth their own.
Well, they behaved them like other traitors. For example, if women weren't prepared to work in the factories to construct weapons, they were sentenced to death. And that had been the same with men who weren't prepared to go to the army. They didn't have a particularly feeling against the belief system of Jehovah's Witnesses. They didn't know the system. They only had the notion that Jehovah's Witnesses didn't adore the system. They weren't prepared, for example, to do the Hitler greeting, to celebrate Hitler's birthday. It was a great day in National Socialist Germany, and that was sufficient. That was it. And they were surprised how strong these small group of believers resisted them.
In the Third Reich, Jehovah's Witnesses faced a unique choice with regard to their faith.
Witnesses were offered to sign a paper to end their relationship with the organization, with the Watchtower Society, and then they could be free. But they didn't do that, and that's the difference to the situation of the Jews. The situation of the Jews, even if the assimilated Jews who didn't even know that their fathers and grandfathers had been Jews, hadn't any chance to flee the system because of their blood.
The Jews were the most persecuted for both religious and racial reasons. From October 1939, they were relocated into large urban ghettos in Warsaw, Lwów, Lublin, and Krakow. To control these communities with a false sense of law and order, the Nazis established the Judenrat, a Jewish council within each ghetto. These forced liaisons between council members and Nazi overseers still remain a sensitive subject today.
Once you are in the ghetto, you basically in the camp to die. All the laws, Germans start with the legal things. They come to the country and they say Jews cannot have a property, Jews cannot have radios, Jews cannot have fur. I mean, all the occupation laws function before the ghetto. Once you are in the ghetto, it's just waiting for death. There's no more law in the ghetto. There are law, but there are Jewish law by Jewish Judenrat. Jews were already deprived of the basic things, and then creating of the Jewish district, of the ghetto, was the final German occupation law, which was based, of course, on a big lie, on a hypocrisy, that actually now, where Jews were already second-class citizens, and to protect them from anti-Semitism, from the conflict with the Christian population, apparently it will be better for them if the part of the city will be designated for them, so they can have their own governance. So my father, who was an engineer in woodworking, construction, was working for the needs of the Jewish Council of Judenrat.
That is the most controversial question about the Shoah. It's about the Jews collaborating. Some say of their own will, some say that they've been forced to, but they were collaborating with the Nazis. Now, the big question is, which kind of collaboration was it? If it was voluntarily, then of course it's a terrible thing. But since we know that the totalitarian regime of the Nazism made people to do things that they would never do in otherwise. And in the concept of what Katzetnik, he was one of the inmates in Auschwitz, and then he became to be a writer and a witness in Eichmann trial, he called it another planet. So in this other planet that have its own rules, have its own language even, people acted differently because they were under a force, under a threat, and they had to manage somehow their own communities. They had to survive. That was always like that. That's how they survived.
The only controversy was a kind of ethical one, whether a Jewish person should help Germans to keep order. They were keeping order with the Jews under the Germans' orders, obviously. Of course, the other solution would be not to have any community organization. It was absolutely a necessity.
On December 7th, 1941, Himmler reinforced Hitler's directive Nacht und Nebel, night and fog, a policy that summarily bypassed the law by relying upon special German courts to sentence suspects in occupied territories to concentration camps. Under the cover of darkness, they simply disappeared. In time of war, treason was punishable by death. As chief judge of the People's Court, Roland Freisler, the hanging judge, frequently chose to enforce the death penalty for many of those who stood before him pleading for justice. Between 1943 and 1945, the People's Court sentenced approximately 7,000 people to death. Maniacal in his tone and harsh in his judgments, Freisler oversaw two historical cases: the members of the White Rose and the conspirators of the July 20th, 1944 assassination plot against Hitler. At the University of Munich, members of the White Rose resistance produced 6 leaflets against the Third Reich. Hans and Sophie Scholl, along with their colleague Christoph Probst and their mentor Kurt Huber, were deeply committed to the high ideals of the White Rose movement. Condemned as conspirators against the government, they were sentenced to death for treason during wartime.
Josef Firma! Na, die gehört aber zur schwarzen Fraktion. Ja, das sieht man Ihnen an. Das ist klar, das kann ja nicht anders sein. Ist ja ulkig. Wie wichtig wohl das Amt des Zivilanwalts da gewesen sein muss, das Sie gehabt haben, dass Sie nicht mal Anwalt, nicht mal Soldat geworden sind mit dem Alter. Und dann von da sind Sie dienstverpflichtet worden. Das spricht ja auch für Ihre Haltung, dass Sie sich haben, dass Sie erst gewartet haben, bis man Sie dienstverpflichtete. Feines Früchtchen. Ja, feines Früchtchen. Sie haben gewartet, bis man Sie dienstverpflichtete. Und zwar, wo sind Sie hingegangen? From Golem, Vergeltung, Огонь!
Outside Stalingrad, the icy winter becomes a fiery hell.
Stories about the atrocities committed by the Nazis began to leak out of Europe, primarily in 1942 and 1943, We actually have documentation from the British in particular, in which British officials are already talking about death camps, places where Jews in particular were being murdered by the hundreds of thousands by poison gas. You can find references to this in government documents from the British already in late 1942, early 1943. So there was a level of awareness already of the scale and the immensity of the crimes being perpetrated. Of course, in 1943 then, Battle of Stalingrad, early 43, Battle of Stalingrad is one of the major turning points. It really looks from this point forward, after the defeat of the Sixth Army, that Nazi Germany's days were numbered.
This was Kyle and Kessel with a vengeance. But the Nazis were getting Kesseled instead of the Russians. And on February the 2nd, 1943, after 162 days of the heaviest fighting in the history of warfare, the last shot was fired. Peace came to Stalingrad. In the shattered streets, the blasted ruins, the ghastly evidence of their ordeal, the defenders of the city greet the rescuing army of the dawn. Stalingrad is free. The Nazis had capitulated.
General Eisenhower informs me that the forces of Germany have surrendered to the United Nations. The flags of freedom fly all over Europe. For this victory, we join in offering our thanks to the Providence which has guided and sustained us through the dark days of adversity.
You see the Allies now beginning to think in terms of what they're going to do with the major war criminals, as they were called. These were the leadership, the leading figures of the Nazi government, Hitler, Goering, Goebbels, and so forth. How are they going to be treated? Churchill and his legal counselor, Lord John Simon, were of the view that the major war criminals were essentially outlaws who did not have to be given their day in court, but could in fact be taken, arrested, identified, of course, and then executed without the benefit of a trial.
These generals, 24 of them, who had covered themselves with such glory and such medals on the fields of Poland and Norway and France, they now had only their past glory to comfort.
Very clearly, the Soviets did not have in mind a trial or a proceeding along the lines of an Anglo-American litigated proceeding. They had in mind instead a show trial, not unlike the Stalinist show trials of the 1930s, in which Stalin was able to identify his alleged enemies, charge them with various imaginary crimes, and secure their conviction and then have them executed in the 1930s. This is the proceeding which they wanted to impose upon the major war criminals. The Soviet foreign minister, Molotov, had already talked with the Allies on behalf of the Soviet government and tried to persuade them that the best way to deal with the major war criminals was by means of a special international tribunal. Stimson was of the view that a special international tribunal could be used in which the major war criminals would be prosecuted, but they would enjoy the same kinds of due process rights which any American accused of an offense would enjoy, the right to hear the charges against them, the right to study the indictment, the right to counsel, and the right to defend themselves in a fair proceeding.
Nuremberg remained a focal point for the National Socialist Party, hosting popular rallies and political congresses starting in 1927. It continued through the Nuremberg Laws of 1935, and again in November 1945, the focus was on Nuremberg, as the city became the seat of the International Military Tribunal to address war crimes and crimes against humanity.
The drums of doom begin to beat for 24 top Nazis as Nuremberg becomes the scene of the War Crimes Tribunal. Among the ruins of this former shrine of Nazism, an ordinary jail houses its former big shots. Each has a solitary cell and is forbidden to talk during exercise. Under indictment are Opera Seitz Inquart, former Gauleiter of Holland. Julius Streicher, fanatical anti-Semit. Rudolf Hess, one-time adjutant of Hitler. And Hermann Goering.
Chief U.S. Prosecutor at Nuremberg, Robert Jackson, stated in his diary that the court was charged with establishing a rule of law in the place where it had been said there would be no more law.
What is the advantage of conspiracy? It afforded the government, the Allied government, with the opportunity to charge the Nazis with a substantive offense as well as participation in a criminal organization, which meant that you did not necessarily have to show an individual criminal act committed by the defendant. What's interesting about conspiracy, again, is that it connects all of the individual charges against the Nazis. So in addition to charging with the Nazis with war crimes, or with crimes against peace or crimes against humanity, they are also charged with conspiracy to commit crimes against peace, conspiracy to commit crimes against humanity, and conspiracy to commit war crimes. So yeah, conspiracy, again, this notion of a criminal organization, the criminal plan to conquer the world, that was the foundation that underlay the entire case, especially on the American side.
One after another, the prosecutors came forward to state the case against the criminals. The first to speak was Robert Jackson.
In the prisoner's dock sit 20 odd broken men, reproached by the humiliation of those they have led, almost as bitterly as by the desolation of those they have attacked. Their personal capacity for evil is forever past. It is hard now to perceive in these miserable men as captives the power by which, as Nazi leaders, they once dominated much of the world and terrified most of it. We will show them to be living symbols of racial hatred, of terrorism and violence, and of the arrogance and cruelty of power.
The Allies really learned of Nazi war crimes when the Nazis embarked on aggressive war. The core theory of the Nuremberg prosecution is that the aggressive war itself was a crime. It's an overarching theory of criminality, and then within the war there are battlefield war crimes. But really, from the time Germany went on the march in 1939 into Poland, there was Allied thinking, particularly American and British thinking, that this was illegal, it violated treaties, it was criminal.
Raphael Lemkin provided Jackson with the foundation for this international law, establishing a paradigm for prosecution of war crimes. Based upon his research of the massacres of more than 1 million Armenians by the Ottoman Turks, Lemkin created the hybrid word genocide.
The very term genocide had only been coined a year before the Nuremberg Trials started. It was coined in 1944 by Raphael Lemkin, who was a Polish Jewish advisor to the U.S. War Department. That term genocide was already used as a descriptive term at Nuremberg, but it wasn't until the UN Convention of 1948 that genocide became recognized as its own independent crime in international law.
In an incremental way, expanding from Germany into the East and occupied nations, Nazi perpetration is a visible thing. What it adds up to, and that it's a planned extermination venture, is something that is, very barely understood, not just during the war years, but even as they're embarking on prosecution. They're really almost sort of discovering what we would call the Holocaust as they're prosecuting it, and getting evidence and realizing the enormity of what they're dealing with.
This would be a way of showing the superior political power, the superior moral power of a kind of a liberal democratic regime, right? So by not pursuing a purely political strategy with respect to the Nazis, but by giving them a fair trial, it was a way of saying, we're gonna give you the chance you never gave your enemies, and it's gonna show that we're stronger and that this is a better path for the future. So it was there was a moral argument for it, but there was also a very profound kind of political argument that this would be a more effective tool for preserving the peace going forward.
The Allies chose to take the moral high ground by providing fair trials. 22 high-ranking Nazi leaders were put on trial for crimes against humanity and crimes against the peace. The historic Nuremberg courtroom 600 is still used for trials today.
The Nazis committed astonishing crimes that we're all very familiar with. Nuremberg was not in the first order a Holocaust trial. It really was, as I mentioned, it was a trial about the launching of aggressive war. But nonetheless, if you look back at Nuremberg, the prosecutors did a pretty impressive and a pretty responsible job of bringing the crimes that the Nazis had committed against the European Jews to the courtroom.
The extensive trials concerning Nazi criminality have continued into the 21st century, with attempts to balance both justice and mercy.
Then there are a series of Allied trials. The most famous of these are the so-called successor trials, also held in Nuremberg before an American military tribunal. These prosecuted functional elites from throughout Nazi society. So there was a trial for doctors, there were a trial for judges, there was a trial of the high command of the army, right? So a series of kind of trials of different elements of the Nazi elite. But there were also Allied military trials, Soviet, British, French, and American, of war criminals lower ranking, right? So the Americans held a trial at the Dachau concentration camp, or a series of trials at the Dachau concentration camp in which hundreds of Nazis were prosecuted. The British had their own trial program, as did the French. The Russians prosecuted about 30,000 Germans for war crimes. Now, these were Russian trials. How fair they were, you know, is anybody's guess. But given the level of Nazi criminality, I always say it's a little bit like shooting fish in a barrel. Even the Russians managed to find a lot of guilty people in that context.
As the Cold War broke out in the wake of an apocalyptic conflict, history had to be rewritten, reframing the Nuremberg trials within the context of victor's justice. Nuremberg still stands as a memorial to international justice, a reminder of the devastating consequences caused by unlawful manipulation of constitutional law for political and racial purposes. The criminal leaders of the Third Reich forced humanity to pay a heavy price.